Yikes. The Arizona Cardinals in 2022, heading into the season, were not a team I was very high on. And I felt for good reason. I don't recall really seeing it. I felt like this was going to be potentially a rough year, maybe Cliff Kingsbury's last year in Arizona. And I only felt more convinced of that once I saw Kyler Murray getting the big money contract extension, because once the details got out about that and you saw that clause about basically a homework clause, that to me was an omen of something is going really, really sideways. Something is really, really wrong here. If you have to put in a homework clause for your quarterback that you were going to pay an absolute shit ton of money to over the next several years, maybe, just maybe, he's not that dude, and you shouldn't be giving him that much money. And not surprisingly, this is not just to lay it all on Kyler Murray. By no stretch of the imagination is that what I'm trying to do here. Because there were issues abound with this team, right? But this season obviously did not go well. Steve Keim, the general manager, was allowed to resign. Cliff Kingsbury was shown the door and fired. And maybe some Cardinals fans look at that and say, hey, that's a welcome relief. Can't get rid of Kyler, but get rid of those two bums. Maybe that's progress. And it could be. Who knows? But yeah, just a lot went wrong this past season. When you look at the fact that they made the trade for Marquise Brown, and then he only played 12 games. DeAndre Hopkins started the year with the PED suspension. He only played 9 games. The defense finished 31st in points allowed. The offense was only 21st in points scored in the league. So a team that's spending that much at quarterback, has that offensive-minded head coach, finishes in the bottom third of the league in points scored. Not good. And then, of course, Kyler Murray tearing his ACL late in the year, and doing it so late in the year, in fact, that he may or may not even be ready for the start of the 2023 season. Not good times for the Arizona Cardinals in the desert. If you're going to ask me what went right, J.J. Watt in his NFL swan song had 12.5 sacks. It was nice to see J.J. Watt go out relatively on top in terms of individual performance. Obviously, the team performance is not there. But he's a guy, come that Hall of Fame class of 2028, he will be a first ballot Hall of Famer, period. He's a top 100 player of all time, period. He's a top, depending upon your perspective, top 5 to 7 defensive end of all time, period. So it was good to see him have one last kind of vintage J.J. Watt type of season. And, if you want to talk about other positives, hey, sometimes there are absolutely positives in defeat, or a lot of defeats, right? And at least the Cardinals were bad enough to where it eliminated all doubt. Steve Keim resigned. Cliff Kingsbury was fired. Those are two probably pretty positive developments for the Cardinals, aren't they? It's not always all bad when you lose a bunch of games like that. And they were ultimately bad enough to end up with the 3rd overall pick in the draft. No, it's not pick 1 or pick 2. Certainly you'd like to have that if you were them. But pick 3 is still a pretty premium spot to have. You can still potentially position yourself really well either with the player that you take in that spot or with the trade that you make out of that spot. But when I look at this offseason, this feels like it's got the Bidwells written all over it, doesn't it? Hiring Monty Ossenfort was curious to me. Yes, he spent the last 3 years as director of player personnel for the Tennessee Titans, but is that who you're trying to be? Is that the organization you want to be like, as the Titans? You could say, well, he comes from the Belichick tree. Yeah, and that's a mixed bag too, right? It's not perfect, but it's not an egregious one. It just, But the one that really just puzzles the hell out of me, I find all types of bizarre, is the hiring of Jonathan Gannon. And I realize you could look and say, hey, the Eagles' defense was great for a good portion of the 2022 season. Here's my thing. You need someone that can work with, challenge, and improve Kyler Murray. How in the blue hell does Jonathan Gannon do that exactly? in a league that continues to gravitate towards those offensive-minded head coaches, why are you going in the opposite direction? Furthermore, why would you watch that Super Bowl and decide that Jonathan Gannon must be your guy? Like, if I was looking at that game and looking at the teams, looking at the different sides of the ball, I would think personally I'd rather have Eric Bieniemy, the offensive coordinator of Kansas City, to work with my young quarterback Kyler Murray, as it was his offensive unit that pounded the Philadelphia Eagles and took advantage of them all game long, and Gannon was unable to adjust. But the Cardinals looked at that and said, yeah, his defense looked like crap. That was his specialty. We want that guy. That'll work out well. Good luck with that is all I got to say. This felt like if Bieniemy was going to get a job in this cycle, it was going to be this one, or should have been this one. But it wasn't. There you go. And you look at the Cardinals, while they're sitting well from a draft standpoint, you look at them, they've got pick number 3 in round 2. They've got pick 35. Then you've got pick 67 and 97 in round 3. So they've got some premium draft capital to work with. They've only got about $25 to $30 million in cap space. Very possibly looking at them trying to trade DeAndre Hopkins too. Like, this is a team that's going to need to do a bit of a dip and reload and almost kind of rebuild on the fly. As they've got some work to do on both sides of the ball here, in my opinion. And I would anticipate, because they hired Jonathan Gannon, because they hired Austin Fort, that they're going to have a heavier defense approach to the offseason in the draft. You know, you certainly could look at, assuming a quarterback goes number 1 in this draft and a quarterback goes 2 to some collection of teams, you know, the Cardinals potentially sit there and find themselves perfectly positioned for either a Will Anderson or a Jalen Carter. That's one option. They could also, you know, if you find out that, hey, this could be a draft where quarterbacks go 1, 2, 3, similar to 2021, the Cardinals still sit in a pretty good spot to have somebody else come up and make a trade, and the Cardinals can peel back a little bit and acquire some additional draft pick capital, which they need. But I just don't know that they will do that. You would assume at this point, unless something dramatically changes in the weeks ahead, especially with the Combine, you would assume that this pick most likely is a defensive player for the Cardinals. And if it is, like, they might get a franchise type of defensive player, but yeah, it still doesn't address the problem you have at the quarterback position. It still doesn't address some of the flaws you have in your offense. So consider me very sheepish on the Arizona Cardinals' chances going into 2023. Who knows what could happen in this offseason, but yeah, I wouldn't expect big things from them.